Where is value in healthcare? Ultimately, the value from a healthcare system is the clinical decision. It's the clinician that decides which drug you're going to get. It's the clinician that's going to decide which treatment is best for you if you're going to come into a healthcare setting or not. We had to, day one, immediately figure out where can we support the biggest value generation, which is the clinical decision ultimately. Which patient do I need to look at? What is happening with them? Why? And what should I do next?
Hey everybody, this week I'm joined by Benedikt Thüngen. And Benedikt is a serial entrepreneur, 5 startups, and he's at the interface of deep tech and healthcare. Had a success in Speechmatics, which was a speech-to-text company, then spent a year driving from Cape Town to London, saw the massive opportunity that data can have to move from a sick care to a true healthcare system. Obviously, that's something we talk about here a lot. Especially exciting given the massive data and innovation explosion we're currently seeing in healthcare. So questions that Benedikt has got: why with all this data and innovation are we still operating a sick care system? Why is it so hard to translate innovation into clinical practice when everyone wants and needs it? In 2021, started the journey to solve that with many twists and turns, have developed their business model where they collaborate closely with selected hospital trusts to translate data into clinically actionable insights to build what is now a clinical co-pilot that supports clinicians to make earlier and better decisions. That lays the foundation for a future healthcare system where we can detect the earliest possible health changes and empower clinicians and patients to act sooner. And that is Sanome. So SANOME.com. So Benedikt, welcome to the Healthtech Podcast. How you doing, mate?
Thank you so much for having me. And this is the first time I've actually heard someone read back the description, and I was just sitting here thinking, gosh, I've got to make this a lot simpler. It sounds like lots of clinical that. So this is actually really useful already.
Pleasure to have you on. 5 successful startups behind you. Wow, that's a heck of a journey, and yeah, delighted to have you in Healthtech solving problems here. So, yeah, I guess the first question, mate, that I ask here is for you to tell your story. So, there's obviously quite a lot to it. Are you a born entrepreneur? Are you a made entrepreneur? Why don't you start at the beginning and tell us a bit of your story?
No, sure. Thank you very much. I don't know, born or made. On a really high level, my story is I've had a pretty messed up childhood. Complicated parents, divorced early, lived in loads of different places, different countries. And I guess the journey started off, we moved to former Eastern Germany just after the war came down. So it was that really big clash of like seeing a country, unified, but two totally different systems of thinking, political systems of working, kind of starting to melt together. And one of the earliest impressions of entrepreneurialism was my late father, who picked up a farm or started a farming business in Eastern Germany, didn't speak the language, didn't know the culture, didn't know anything, and he just went for it. Wow. And over the course of 10 years or 12 years, he built it into a pretty big, pretty successful company, arable farm, dairy farm, and everything in between, which was pretty cool. And then he decided to totally pivot and retrained as a professional musical singer. As you do.
Quite different.
Totally different. So, sorry, I just paused for a second because he passed away only about a month ago. So it's pretty recent. But one of the things I highlighted in the eulogy was his ability to always stand up again after failure or after adversity. And I think that is very many cases kind of one of the key hallmarks in entrepreneurship. It's not about the idea, right? It is the ability to get through the difficult moments and grind your way through. Because let's be honest, right? Most of the time as a founder, particularly in healthcare, you're just dealing with some shit. Something's gone wrong somewhere, something you've forgotten, be that funding has collapsed, be that a customer's dropped out, be that you've forgotten about a regulation somewhere, a patient has unfortunately had a complication. Always, right? There's always something that goes wrong. So coming back to that journey piece, I think I've been extremely lucky to see that in a father who has demonstrated time and time again that it's totally okay to fail, and it's because you're always able to stand up again. The chaotic kind of childhood, I guess, continued all the way through to today, right? Totally restless, do lots of different things. I read biotechnology and business at undergrad, and I was desperately looking for money, as I think every student is, right? And I got really lucky that I got a job in a Farmers Weekly magazine that was to be a translator, tour guide translator for renewable energy study tours to Austria and Germany. So ended up being on that, found myself on a bus with a bunch of farmers. Literally just, I'm fortunate enough to be bilingual, and we just looked at a bunch of biogas plants, solar parks, blah, 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 in Austria. And the difference, this was 2006, 2007. The difference between where the UK was and where Europe was just stark. It was just unbelievable. Yeah, they were already fully deploying renewable energy, fully going with it. And the UK was still arguing about, should we build another coal-powered fire station? And this meetup ended up, my father was then actually involved as well. This ended up to saying, hey, why don't we actually do something? Why don't we start importing renewable energy technology into the UK? And I said, cool, I speak German, I can help a bit. And alongside university, I can't just drink all the time, so I've got to do something sensible. And that eventually then, through a few twists and turns, we identified a technology in Austria that was building biogas plants that was somewhere between 30 and 50% more efficient than what was in the market. And what was really fascinating is the team there that had built this technology, they looked at it and said, well, what does the biology need in order to be really successful? Versus what everyone else is doing and saying, how can we bring the engineering costs down and make it more efficient? And this simple approach is, let's say, what does the biology need? And let's build the engineering around what the biology needs. Turned out to be, even though the cost was higher, the total project was somewhere between 30 and 50% more efficient. So we bundled up the technology. We formed a company called Renewable Zukunft, went out to raise some capital in 2008. And we managed to raise £6 million 2 or 3 weeks after Lehman Brothers collapsed. And just as a funny anecdote or a story, I mean, we had no idea. We had no idea how to raise money. There wasn't really a venture capital scene in London at the time. There was, you could count the funds on one hand, and they're typically some ex-private equity guys. And they'd heard about venture in the US, and they kind of rebranded. And some amazing conversations, but we knew we were running out of money in August, September time. So in April, we said, it's fine. We've got like 4 or 5 months. So we went out and had the conversation with all the funders and said, we're going to run out of money. And they said, not a problem at all. We can do this deal in 3 weeks, 4 weeks, not a problem. Obviously, the due diligence continues. We get to August, the company runs out of money. We get to September, we are literally on our last legs. Maxed out all the credit cards, all that kind of stuff. At the same time, the terms of the investment deal obviously go from whatever it was, low 20% dilution to 25 to 30% dilution, and so on and so forth. And I remember quite vividly, this was all before we had internet on mobile phones. We still had Blackberries and that kind of stuff. So you could just about get a news ticker. And we'd scrape together literally the last pennies we had amongst us. And we took a train down to London to sign the investment documents. Everything was kind of lined up. You still had you couldn't do DocuSign and stuff, didn't exist. Right? So you still had to, we were still using fax machines. Not quite as bad, but not far off. So we worked through the night, got there, and we were welcomed by the secretary. And they said, really, really sorry, but the partners are still in the meeting. But they will eventually come with you. And we sat around. And it got to like 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening. I can't remember the exact date. I think it was 21st or 23rd of September, which was the day that Lehman Brothers collapsed. Right, and eventually one of the partners comes out, and they said, really sorry, we've just had this emergency. I don't know if you've seen the news, but the financial markets are in total meltdown. But very fortunately, they stuck with us. The deal terms became really horrific. Personal guarantees.
I bet. I mean...
we signed the deal. I think it was like 9th of October or something in that ballpark. Got the money. We said, great, let's go out and let's start building a team. And then in the subsequent 2 years or so, we went and built a bunch of plants, biogas plants in Austria and Germany. Never really quite got off the ground in the UK. Made a few massive mistakes, but I was still at university at the time. So it was kind of balancing a year abroad in Spain with helping to build out the team in Austria, with helping kind of setting up stuff it was just chaos. It was amazing. Gosh, a few big lessons learned from that time period was definitely hired the wrong team. Yeah, they were individually amazing people, but we went for senior experience. We thought that people with coming out of very big corporates have all the right Rolodex, all the cool stuff. But when it comes to the ground in the early days of a startup, you don't necessarily need that much experience. You need some experience. You just need people who ask the questions, just get on, do shit. Yeah, the investors were just the wrong fit of investors. They just didn't understand. But effectively what happened is, because we were building these 3-5 million pound plants, we always had to go and raise debt from banks. And during the financial crisis, prices went up, got too expensive. Yeah. So we went insolvent in 2010. Summer of 2010, literally just as I was finishing my dissertation. That was a fun time. And I won't go into the detail because it's too boring, but literally the worst thing that happened out of all of that, obviously your ego takes a massive knock. And suddenly your whole life purpose is like, shit, what do I actually do next? What do I do now? The worst thing that actually happened is our accountant really messed up some share allocation stuff. So I was hit with a tax bill for effectively nothing. And I then had to make that difficult personal decisions. Do I go through insolvency, or do I just pay the whole damn thing back? So that's eventually what I did. The only thing, because obviously I had that to my name, is everything was totally fine. I could have a bank account and stuff. The only one that was really annoying were the mobile phone operators who just said, because you had that to your name, we can't give you a mobile phone contract for £20 a month or whatever it was. I had to do a pay as you go. Fine, whatever. Goodbye. So that was my first big taste on being in a startup. And the sensible thing I did, and I think my mother in particular, my then stepfather, talked me into and said, look, you need to get some stability in your life, get proper training. You should do the traditional route and go into consulting. I spent 6 months in a very cool biotech company, but then went into consulting, spent 3 years in consulting, management consulting, which was brutal. It was really, really brutal. It was very useful learning, but effectively had to relearn everything. Knock down your ego and say, no. Your job is to make PowerPoint look pretty, so shut up. So that came to an end, and then got very, very lucky. Didn't really know what I wanted to do, other than I want to start a business again. I want to be in the space, and looked at the different ecosystems and said, right, where are the big clusters of innovation happening globally? Right? And you obviously look at California, you look at New York, Boston, you're looking at Cambridge, Oxford, London. And I said, okay, I want to do something in that space at the interface of deep tech, science, and something. And got very lucky, got accepted on a course called Bioscience Enterprise at Cambridge, which is all about commercializing life sciences, healthcare, bioscience, innovation. How do you build a business? Effectively a mini MBA, but very hands-on and very much focused on the complexity of healthcare and life sciences. So got very lucky, spent a year there, and it was probably one of the best years of my life. It was just amazing team, so much innovation, so much insight, so many smart people. So we set up a company off the back of that called Cure Genius, which the hypothesis we had was there's a huge amount of medication wastage and a huge amount of adverse events happening because patients are not taking their medication. So statins being an obvious example. So why don't we try and help patients with taking their medication better? This was just as the smartphone revolution was hitting Europe. So everyone was having the iPhone 3. So it's like 2013, 2014. So why don't we help patients with that? So the idea was really simple. You get a prescription medication, you scan it with your phone. It pulls all the relevant medication information, synchronizes it with your calendar, pushes you reminders of saying this is when you have to take your medication. And the way we were going to monetize it is by collecting real world data, or what they now call real world evidence, to say how are patients actually feeling, responding, that kind of stuff. Naively, we thought, oh, this is kind of a no-brainer. Everyone's going to go for it. The NHS is going to adopt it, etc. And we spent 6 months or 9 months banging our heads against the wall, because there is no such thing as the NHS. There's no one organization you can go to and say, take it. There were like hundreds, if not thousands, of individual groups of people and organizations. Plus, the other thing is that no one wanted to pay for it. They said, well, that's great, but why should I do it? Right? So brutally learned the lesson of no NHS, and payments in healthcare are a lot more complex than most people think. And in many ways, that was actually a blessing in disguise. After a year of a master's degree and then several months of trying to do this, I was just totally skint and no money. And so I got very, very lucky. And this is a common thing. I think a huge amount of stuff in entrepreneurship is just serendipity. Like, tell me whatever you want, but it's all luck. Right? I would say it's probably the biggest impact is just luck. Right? Being there at the right place, right time. Met Tony Robinson, who is probably one of the leading researchers or people in AI, or what is now known as AI, neural networks, who since the 1980s had been working on the problem of using neural networks for problem of speech recognition. So he's very often considered probably the grandfather of speech rec, and he will cringe when I say that, because he's one of the most humble people I've ever met. But the brain the size of the planet, an unbelievably lovely person. And he was saying, look, I've got this piece of tech. I mean, remember, this was like 2013, 2014. So AI wave hadn't really happened yet in Europe. And he said, well, doing this neural network stuff, it's quite cool. And I'm looking for someone to help me commercialize it. And I said, cool, look, I can take a look. But let's see. I don't know much about software. I don't know anything about software, really. And I definitely don't know anything about speech recognition, but I'll have a look. And I know a little bit about building people and raising money and all that kind of wonderful stuff. And within 2 or 3 months of working with him, we signed a 7-figure license deal. And you go like, wow, enterprise software is so much easier than healthcare. So joined as a founding CEO, I guess, which the main initial job was, how do we translate what was effectively research into a commercializable product? Yes, so many lessons learned along that journey, but it was just such a wonderful ride. Went from, I think, 4 people or 5 people in a shed to, when I left, about 55, 60-ish people, several million pounds of turnover, which sold to pretty much every major tech company globally. We've met the CEOs, C-level people at pretty much every major tech company, be that Sony, Samsung, Facebook, Adobe, Deloitte, you know, it was just Bloomberg. It was just amazing. It was one of these incredible journeys where we had a piece of tech that was just so vastly better than anything else that was in the market. And we were so much at the cutting edge of, use it, AI as a buzzword here. It was just great, right? It's just phenomenal. And had this magical moment of getting the team right for a period of time. And it was just like, everything was just flying. The big mistake, I guess, we made was we didn't raise enough capital. We were we grew most of it out of cash flow, which I think, given where the tech could have been today, it could have very easily been $1 billion company. The other one was, we had pretty much every major tech company trying to buy us at one point, and some of the offers that were put in were just astronomical. From a personal point of view, could have walked away very, very, very wealthy and probably considered as one of the most successful tech people in the UK ecosystem. But from a brutal lesson, the scale up of going from, let's say, 20 people to 50 people, and how do you productize, how do you operationalize an organization? I've learned so much through that. That, for me personally, that's priceless. Left late 2018 and really just needed a break. Flew to South Africa, literally just to see some friends. Ended up buying a car on a whim, and then deciding, hey, why don't I just drive back to Europe and see what happens?
Nice.
Spent the best part of a year doing that. Got bored, obviously, within 2 weeks. And connected with a friend, and we set up a foundation to mentor and help startups in emerging countries, because he was with his partner traveling around the world, but he was doing, I think, Asia and Australia and South America at the time, and just had this unbelievable luck of mentoring and working with startups across the African continent. And wow, I mean, we are so arrogant in Europe and the US, where we think, oh, there's nothing there. It's the quality of entrepreneurs there, the amount of adversity they're overcoming just to build something that they're passionate about and believing. And the quality is just insane. It's just insane. And I think the entire journey, there were like 2 spots or maybe 3 spots where I had no internet. And by internet, I mean like 4G. I remember being in the depths of the Serengeti, and it was some rugby match. I can't remember which one it was. I think England, Australia or something. We were live streaming it on a mobile phone in the middle of nowhere. And I'd show me anywhere in even in London where you can do that at like high definition, right? And it was such a great year. But what I was kind of realizing and kind of building in my head is these kind of 2. Well, I'll take renewable energy out. That's a big passion of mine. But the 2 big things I was like building in my head and say, wow. So I know a little bit about how do you take unstructured data and turn it into insights, like call centers. How do you turn a call center conversation into something that's actionable and useful? And then the big passion, obviously, being in healthcare, life sciences space. And I said, well, there must be something that we can start merging these two fields together. I was kite surfing in Egypt, and I got a small cut on my foot. And you'll probably recognize this, James, as a former clinician. I just ignored the cut. Well, how bad can it be, right? Within 2 or 3 days, was developing a fever. It was 2 or 3 days, the fever got pretty damn severe. They took me into, well, what was the hospital there? It was basically a shed. And kind of they tried some different medication. I had no idea what it was, and said, something, the wound looks pretty infected. They tried some painkillers, and eventually they just pinned me down and just got out a scalpel and cut out a chunk of my foot and say, well, that will help and that will save it. Cutting a long story short, obviously didn't get a lot better. And a few weeks later was in Turkey. Something wasn't quite right. Just went for a checkup in one of the most amazing hospitals I've ever seen, Acıbadem in Istanbul. And they literally just did a whole battery of tests, looked at the data and said, sorry, we're going to take you in straight away. And within 4 hours of had an operation done, everything was fine. And they said, look, you had a pretty bad infection here, which probably could have been terminal. And I think that for me was kind of quite a trigger point of kind of saying, if we have data available, a clinician can make the right decision to make the right action. Now, obviously that one there was driven by just the development and the access that I have as an individual to the different healthcare systems. So Egypt, probably non-existent, rural, middle of nowhere, versus big capital, private hospital, etc. But that's when this a fundamental idea was saying, well, hang on a minute. We have all of this data increasingly in healthcare. Why are we not using it? Why are we not supporting clinical decision-making with that? So got back and said, cool, really clear in my head and said, I want to do something with data and in healthcare to really see, can we improve patient outcomes? And reconnected with an old friend of mine out of Cambridge, who was working on a novel set of algorithms that could model biological systems. So we started building out, say, can we build a human digital cell and then use that to model potential, if I put a drug into that cell, can we model potential outcomes that can then be used to drive drug development, or ultimately, can we use that to drive clinical decision making? And it's an unbelievably complex problem because we're dealing with biomedical data, which is all over the place. It's messy typically. It comes in different formats, all that kind of problem that happens with kind of multimodality. And we got some really good results. And I remember this was just as COVID started happening, I think. So it must have been early 2020. And we had an investor, brilliant investor, on the call, and we just said, look, we're going to pitch it. And one of the most fascinating DD calls I've ever had, it was 20 minutes and they put an offer in.
Jeez.
And the conversation basically, and we called it the human digital twin, right? And I'll come back to that later because we said, well, look, we can model a human cell. Why don't we now start building human systems? And ultimately we'll get to a human digital twin where we can say, we'll take your healthcare data, we'll model it into a system, and then we can kind of predict potential health outcomes.
Test drugs on it virtually, like an F1 car.
Exactly. And this was just so good. So we sat on this call, and then the first call was, Benedikt, when can you build me my personal human digital twin? And I said, well, look, slow down. Blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, how do we know it works? And I said, well, I was a little bit cocky, and my co-founder at the time, he was the main founder, kind of kicked me under the table because I do what I very often do, is I said, well, just pick any molecule and we will drop it into the model, and in a few minutes we can tell you if it works or it doesn't work.
There you go.
And obviously, he built the whole thing, started sweating profusely. I said, you idiot, we're kicking me under the table. So why the hell do you do that? I did the same thing at Speechmatics with Facebook as well, where Facebook just said, because we had one of the key things at Speechmatics was we could build a new language in a matter of days, which was just it was groundbreaking. So anyone could come along and said, hey, I want a speech recognition system for Swahili. And within a few days, we could turn around and say, here it is. It was unbelievable. It was so cool what the team had built. And we were with Facebook in the room, literally everyone, the who's who of Facebook in the room. And I make this outlandish statement. And I said, yeah, this we can do. They said, this is impossible, right? We are speech scientists. We've been doing this for 30 years. This is impossible. And I said, no. I will set you up for a challenge. Your team with the unlimited resources at Facebook versus our team with no resources at all. And we'll see who can deliver the best language possible in 2 weeks. And I said 2 weeks is fair. And at that point, Tony kicks me on the table. Same story again. I said, you're going to tell us to play and all that shit. I said, no, I trust my team. And knowing that one of the key people there was of Indian descent and was almost certainly going to pick Hindi because it was also the biggest growth market at the time for Facebook. So lo and behold, they pick Hindi. So I then send a message back to the engineering team and say, yeah, guys, could you build Hindi, please? We need it ASAP. They are like, oh my God, here we go again. Within 2 days, they shipped a fully working Hindi model, which had one really weird quirk in it, which was great because no one obviously in the office spoke Hindi. And one of the engineers looked at it, and Sanskrit is, I'm not going to use the right terminology, but Sanskrit is you have basically a line and then you have one of them goes down and the vowels go upwards. And he thought that the top bit is just beautification. So he just removed everything. So everything we were then presenting backwards, back to the team was the accuracy was near perfect. It just didn't have any vowels. But we shipped a model. By the time I got back to Cambridge 2.5 days later, we'd already shipped a fully functioning model to Facebook and say, here it is, go and test it out. It was unbelievable. Wow. It was so cool. It's one of the proudest moments I have of Speechmatics. But anyway, so come back to Sentenza was the company. So we're sitting on this investment call, and it was the same. It was the day after Donald Trump said, "Oh, just pour bleach into all these people and it will fix it."
Ah, yes, I remember.
So the investors have said, "Well, okay, why don't we just use bleach, whatever the main ingredient is, bleach, and we see if it kills the human digital cell that you had or not." So obviously, okay, let's find the code and let's drop it in. Let's see what happens. You can see that the wheel's spinning. And then we're just in a bated breath, and eventually it pops up and it comes back as 0. And 0 meant in the model output is dead. The cell is going to die. So we said, boom. And they said, this is fantastic. How much money do you want? It was awesome.
Wow.
So yeah, that was really, really good. What then happened, unfortunately, was kind of two things. The first thing that happened, I then spent probably a month or a month and a half trying to figure out and say, okay, now we're going to have this human digital cell or human digital twin. Who the heck is going to pay for this? And because it was so focused on drug development and testing different drugs, we kept coming back to the same equation saying the only way this can probably be used is in drug development. And if we use it in drug development, you only really have two business models we could think of. It's either a SaaS offering to pharmaceutical companies to say, do you want to test your drugs before they go to market? Which the market is pretty small from a size perspective. At least back then it was, or our assumptions were. The other thing was, okay, we're just going to become an asset-based company ourselves. And that's the only way to really build big value. And for me personally, I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to say, I'm going to spend the next 10 or 20 years trying to develop a drug that may or may not
a whole different beast.
Get to market in phase 3. Not going to do it.
Yeah.
And so Clayton and I parted ways. in 2021, I believe. No, late 2020. And in many cases, that was an absolute turning point, because coming back to that core premise of what I was thinking about, saying, okay, we've got this unbelievable amount of data. We've got the AI now increasingly that's able to interpret this. How can we use it to really drive change in healthcare, particularly against the big backdrop? And then we saw that during COVID, where demand for healthcare services is effectively going up exponentially. Whereas healthcare supply is by default linear. And we really saw that is it scissors? That gap is really starting to go up. And you don't need any PhD or anything to really look at it and think about it and say, that's what's happening. Demographic shift, aging population. The demand curve is just going to go up and linear. We can argue about hiring more doctors and more nurses and building 40 new hospitals or whatever we want to do. Fundamentally, we have this problem of this massive growing healthcare gap. And the only way to solve it is, in my personal opinion, is the earliest possible detection of adverse events. So the earlier we can say to a clinical team, this patient's starting to deteriorate, go and do something about it, the lower the healthcare burden. And obviously with all the complexity of, we don't want to overtest and, but we can talk about that, right? So that's really where Sanome then ultimately came about, is saying, right, can we leverage data to drive better clinical decisions around earlier detection of patient health changes? And it needs to go both ways. So early identification of deteriorating patients, earlier identification of improving patients, so you can discharge them home or get them out of the healthcare system. And that's really where it started, just over 2.5 years ago.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story, man, and we'll definitely go into that a little bit more. I want to take you back to stuff that you said near the beginning, actually. And first of all, sorry to hear about your dad. I know that we were due to record last time when everything kicked off, so obviously really sorry to hear about that, man. And like, it's interesting. It's interesting what you said about what we learn from our parents as well, and like the behaviors that parents exhibit are just taken on by kids, aren't they? And I don't know how many times your dad actually sat you down and said to you very directly, it's okay to fail, or whether he, actually, shaking your head like he might not have actually said those words. It's more just treating you in a way that showed you that as a behavior, it's okay to fail. As a way to live your life, it's okay to fail. And that's interesting to me because of how you told your story, because I can't count the amount of times that you said the words journey, ride. You said a phrase which was fascinating to me. It was chaos. It was amazing. It's funny that like you're viewing this whole thing when you talk about the potential of an exit that you didn't get, but what you learned instead was priceless. Like, these are all such interesting phrases to me as an entrepreneur, because like, I start sort of tongue in cheek, entrepreneurs born or made. The things that make somebody an entrepreneur, some of those I think you're born with. And I'd list a lot of that stuff as something that you maybe were born with, maybe given to by your father, like you were given this mindset, you were given this way of living, you were given this way of going about your career, which was take massive risk and fail, but aim for something massive and meaningful. And that seems to have followed you in like everything that you've done. It reminds me of speaking to like Max Parmentier from Birdie. Actually, you guys are very similar in that, like, you don't tackle the small problem and hope to sort of exit within an industry. Almost, you're sort of doing that almost like Mark Cuban thing of like, no, I want to tackle the industry. I want to tackle the industry norms and actually go at things at that level, because like the way you're going into things like renewable energy with fresh eyes, you're going into, semi-fresh eyes, like given what you've studied and stuff, but then healthcare with fresh eyes and these other things, like you're using this sort of like, looking at things as a beginner mentality and going, how can I actually use this beginner mentality to question like what everyone considers normal, and then how do I solve the problem? It's just a really interesting way of living, I think, as an entrepreneur to get to where you are, which is really nice. The question I had though was, In 2008, you were cutting as an entrepreneur. You were starting to be an entrepreneur, right? In 2008. What did you? Because that's a period that I don't know about as sort of being in my career. But I know about financial difficulty and cycles, and I've seen a couple of those, I think, now, although not at the extremes of that. I'm interested, though, what did 2008 teach you as an entrepreneur? What did you do? What do you do differently now because of what you went through in 2008? That's the bit I'm interested in, because selfishly, that's the golden information, because I want to know that as an entrepreneur, how are you different now? What do you do differently now because of what you've seen then? So that's my question. Because here's why I ask, right? Here's one of the reasons I ask, or here's one of my hypotheses. Like, knowing that is even possible, that collapse at that scale is even possible, is not the case for a lot of people that are starting entrepreneurship now. They've never seen or heard of a collapse that large, that essentially the fabric of the entire financial system just utterly went in one go. But people that are starting businesses now, that are looking after their own personal finance or business finance now, do not know that that's even possible. But I don't know, you might tell me there's no point even hedging against that, because actually that is so ridiculous. And, you know, if we default again to that level, then we're all screwed. So maybe don't hedge for that anyway. Don't even consider that anyway. But I don't know. I mean, I'm interested. Like, what do you do differently?
Good question. Just before I answer it, and just touching on the reason I was shaking my head was not because he didn't tell me. I think it's more of a sad shake of heads, and it just reminded me. And he never really told me directly per se. Maybe once, but it's just living it. And living it in the sense of he suffered from bipolar disorder, so kind of that's part of the diseases, right? You have the extreme highs and extreme lows, and it's fairly normal to collapse. And as brutal as it is, that collapse and the ability just to get up and start again, right? I think that, and I was just like, that's where I kind of slow like, oh shit, there's so many memories that are flooding back, and so even holding back tears at one point. It was like, oh shit, right? But anyway, coming back to your question, I'm going to answer it in a slightly different way, but I'll get to it. I think there are fundamentally three types of risk, or three groups of risk. There are directly risks that you can control, right? It's who do you hire, which customers do you do, all that kind of relatively manageable, stressful, terrible risks. Then there are the slightly bigger risks that you have an influence on, but you don't really control them, right? Your investor behavior, your big customer behavior. What are they going to do? What happens in the NHS a lot, right? You build all these incredible relationships, and then they have a organizational reshuffle, and then suddenly all of your clinical champions are no longer available, right? That kind of stuff. You kind of control it, but you don't really control it. And then the third one you have are these really big, beastie macro risks that sit there that you just have no influence on whatsoever. COVID, the war, financial crisis, you name it, right? Changes in political circumstances. And the way I kind of think about it a lot more. Back then, I said nothing is down to luck. You can control everything. You can be the master of your own destiny, right? That youthful 21 or whatever it was, you just think you can just storm ahead, and that naivety, which is brilliant, because you always need that naivety to tackle a big problem, because the arrogance of wanting to say, I want to revolutionize healthcare. I want to rewrite the healthcare system. It's unbelievably arrogant, because you're not, right? You're just not going to do it because it's too complex. But I think when you're in your early 20s, you really believe you can, right? And even now at Sanome, I really think that I can contribute. I'm deliberately using the word contribute towards the shift from a sick care into a healthcare system. But I wouldn't have that naivety of saying that I'm going to change healthcare. So the big difference was, I think right now I have that much more of a thing and say, I can definitely control the bottom layer, right? And I'm definitely, with the experience, a lot more cognizant about your hiring. So give you a great example. Probably the best bit of advice I've been given is, in an organizational structure, a whole is better than an arsehole. And it's the best bit of hiring advice I've ever been given. up to 30, 50 people, a bad hire has such a negative impact on your culture and your organization, on your delivery. It drags down everyone. Your A players suddenly perform like B players, your B players go to C, all that kind of stuff. A whole is always better than an asshole. But you can control that, right? And I'm unbelievably lucky to be working with my co-founder, Paul, who was my number 2 at Speechmatics. And he is just so good at managing these kind of day-to-day risks that happen, hiring, your commercial exposure, your cash flow risk, all of that kind of wonderful stuff. But I think the lesson learned is I can't control the really big stuff. I should, as fast as possible, try and mitigate the risk. And one of the many reasons I went into healthcare is everyone needs healthcare.
Indeed.
Is that are people willing to pay for it? That's a different question. But ultimately, people will get sick. People need to be treated. And the trajectory is clinicians are so overstretched, they need any help they can get to make their lives easier and better and make better clinical decisions. So it's almost what Tony at Speechmatics always said. He did his PhD in speech recognition because he was convinced that we would never solve the problem of speech recognition. So there was job guarantee for the rest of his life. Now, what has happened is, we haven't solved it, but we pretty much got there, right? So, where was I going with this? But ultimately, the saying that I've got to be cognizant of it, but there's no point sweating it, right? If the UK or Europe decides to go into a big war right now, there's not much I can do with it. Right? And so I've got to focus on the bottom risk and I've got to focus on that middle risk. That's... I don't know if that was a good answer, but
it was. It was because ultimately you went through that enormous thing. It could happen again, but you've acknowledged to control what you can control rather than worrying about what you can't. And actually, I think that's an incredibly reasonable thing to say, an incredibly reasonable way to actually live life in a lot of ways. And I try and do that as much as I can. I want to talk to you about Sanome, and it's the clinical co-pilot, the thing that started as a digital twin, the idea that with more data we can predict, and with prediction we can prevent, and with prevention we can be more healthier, and with more healthy people the system at scale can run more efficiently and at lower cost. That money can be reinvested into better healthcare. It becomes a flywheel and everyone's better off. A wonderful vision and story, quite often a fictional story. We haven't seen that play out in reality just yet. People like yourself are working on it. My first question is, when you think about that as part of Sanome, my question is, where are you positioning it? Because you could position this at one end at intensive care. You could say at intensive care, there's so many beeps, there's so many squeaks, there's so much data that just floats into midair that nobody's capturing at any point. That's an absolute hotbed for this type of thing. And so this could be done there. At the other end of the scale, and therefore you could, by the way, in that ITU setting, you can predict decline, you can prevent mortality, is one way of putting it, right? The other position, though, where this can be used is optimizing health at the complete other end. So you could take relatively healthy, relatively normal people with relatively low, if not any comorbidities, and you could get all of their data in the community, and you can prevent them getting type 2 diabetes, or perhaps even in the more extreme optimization element of that, you could say, well, I'm going to make sure you're at the absolute healthy range, and even you're not going to be high or low of normal, and I'm going to keep you there. And that's where I'm going to predict, and I'm going to prevent absolute decline from anywhere that isn't completely normal or optimized or excellent. So when you are building Sanome and you're thinking about this problem to solve, which end of that scale are you working at, and why?
Brilliant question. So I'll take a step back and I'll come back to that question. So one of the big things I realized, very fortunately, we realized as an organization early on, is where is value in healthcare? And ultimately, the value from a healthcare system is the clinical decision. right? It is the clinician that decides which drug you're going to get. It's the clinician that's going to decide which treatment is best for you if you're going to come into a healthcare setting or not, right? Because that unlocks a cost somewhere that someone's got to pay for it. So we had to, day one, immediately figure out where can we support the biggest value generation, which is the clinical decision ultimately. So we have to position ourselves as a clinical co-pilot that supports that clinical decision making and say, which patient do I need to look at? What is happening with them? Why? And what should I do next? So if we take kind of your two ends, so let's start with the ICU. And a lot of organizations go into the ICU setting because, as you said, time is super critical. The data is generally pretty good, right? You get it every 15 seconds, you may get an observations reading. Yes, there's lots of bleeps and alert fatigue and stuff. But everyone then says, oh, great, I've built this sepsis prediction module, right? We can predict sepsis 3 hours earlier. Which many exist, and we've done the benchmarking and fine, right? And then I'm looking at it and saying, from a patient outcome point of view, great, we can get sepsis a couple of hours earlier. We can probably reduce mortality. Now, show me a single paper where in a randomized control study, that mortality has actually been impacted. There aren't any, not to my knowledge at least.
I agree with you, yeah.
The other thing that is really fascinating, if we now purely look at the health economics, and it's brutal, like we've just been through it the last few months, a dead patient, as horrible as it sounds, is a good patient because I can get a new patient into that ICU bed. That is the brutal reality from a pure financial point of view. A hospital, no matter what the healthcare system, will make more money by having a fresh patient in that thing because there's a battery of tests I can do. I can get the most expensive care. And as soon as a patient's kind of still sitting in ICU, but the care goes down, the return on that patient.
In a fee for service model, yes, definitely. Yes.
Correct. Well, even if we take a budget-based model where I'm paying based on patient throughput in some shape or form.
Well, yeah.
Right? I'm being very, very simplistic here, right? I mean, this is a whole different podcast.
You're presenting the argument. Yeah, no, I understand.
Yeah. So where does the biggest cost end up in a hospital setting, right? And I'll come back to why we chose hospital setting. Is generally speaking, a patient that sits on a low-cost ward, so your general ward, post-surgical ward, whatever, and they have a complication that suddenly bumps up.
Got you.
So suddenly,
the biggest delta. Yeah.
The cost. It's the biggest delta, right? It's terrible for a patient because they were about to be going home and suddenly they had kidney failure or thrombosis or a pressure sore or an infection. So it's terrible for patient outcomes. The knock-on effect, the cost, because it blocks the bed, because the patient stays in hospital for longer, the cost is obviously higher. And then readmission rates go up and muscular atrophy and all that stuff happens. So the biggest impact on cost in many cases is either avoid a patient going into hospital, or once they're in the hospital, avoid them from having complications. Now, taking the other side of your extreme, where we're looking at, let's say, community-based healthcare, we want to keep people in their healthy range all the time. Now, two quick things here. One of them is, what is the clinical decision here? Well, there isn't really one, unless I'm doing preventative stuff. But the challenge from a data science point of view initially is you're dealing with a incredibly rare event. So you have to look at huge amounts of data to even have one, diabetic retinopathy event that you reduce. So you're kind of narrowing the field of where you have to start off with if you want to get to that long-term vision of a human digital twin. So how do I get there? Well, I build a clinical co-pilot to begin with that looks at patient deteriorations in some of the most costly settings, i.e. your secondary care or tertiary care setting. We pick indications that are common across, or we pick complications that are common across all indications. So hospital-acquired infections. Because what am I now doing? And we're about to get Class 2B accreditation. We're going live in the first hospital in 2 weeks. What I'm now doing is I'm monitoring nosocomial infections. I'm warning a clinical team and saying, I think this patient's starting to develop an infection. Get in early to stop it from becoming septic, or just give them an oral antibiotic, it's fine. But under the hood, I'm actually looking at the data and say, oh, this patient had diabetes, this patient had cardiovascular problems. What other complications can I start predicting out of that data flow? And what I'm then starting to do, that clinical co-pilot that supports the clinician, is now learning more about, decompression events or whatever. And I can start adding more and more warning or clinical decision support and say, this patient over here is starting to deteriorate because of, or this patient not deteriorating, so that patient's safe to discharge. And suddenly I've got the toolbox to get to that big digital twin vision, which I can then move into the ICU if I want to, or I can start moving into primary care and saying, or even community-based care, because I have the evidence that it actually works and impacts health economic benefit, it drives the clinical decision, and it improves patient outcome.
It's a really good answer. I think, going to where the money is, frankly. And I know that you and I have talked about this before, about the requirement of healthcare to actually restore quite a lot of confidence in the investor world and the financial world, because that's what's actually going to drag more resource into our world that we can actually do things with. And I think it's one of those things. It's interesting where you raise the point. You say it brutally to raise the point that there are perverse incentives within the system for how the money moves in hospitals. This was one of the most difficult lessons I ever learned when I was a doctor doing quality improvement projects. Like the fact that an empty bed is worse than just replacing it, sort of like that. It was really difficult. I was, quite young as a junior doctor to learn that, and it's quite harrowing when you think about it and the things that happen and don't because of it. However, you have to play within those rules if you're going to then develop it or create enough impact to then, as you say, then move it across that spectrum that I talked about, from keeping the well and actually the intensive care at worse. Like in order to spread across that, you need to go where you can create that flywheel of impact and value back to the system so that you can then spread it for impact, which is obviously incredibly important. I wanted to talk to you very quickly about regulation, because you mentioned Class 2B. This obviously doesn't use large language models if you're on the way to Class 2B, because it needs to be deterministic. You need to see what's inside the black box. And so wonderful that you're getting Class 2B. Obviously, it's reading data. It's giving clinicians a signal. And just like an ECG machine would, gives a signal, and therefore the clinicians are then going to have to look at that signal, trust it, and make a decision. By the way, that's why large language models, one of the reasons they can't get regulated, because we can't trust the signal, i.e. the words that it's creating, and therefore they're struggling to get through. How difficult has that been as a journey?
The regs or the tech? Or both?
Well, actually, let's do both. Let's do both. What is the tech, and how did you find the regulation journey?
Cool. First of all, I love regulation. I think it's the best thing since sliced bread. I'm probably the only person to ever say that. And I say it because, yes, it's brutal and it's boring, but it is your biggest defensive moat.
It is.
One. Two is, it's the only way to build trust with highly skeptical clinical teams and CFOs in hospital. If I have a peer-reviewed paper that unequivocally show there's an improved patient outcome, there's a cost and a time saving, you're winning, right? Then you just still got to figure out the adoption problem. So what is the tech? So under the hood, what we have built is a foundational model for healthcare data. And it's deliberately set up as multimodal. So we can read in clinical notes, observations, so your vitals data, image data, bloods, you name it. So everything that kind of floats around in a healthcare system. It also works. I'm going to get slapped on by a head of AI for using the wrong terminology here. So if anyone listening is an expert in machine learning or clinical AI, please do ping me and correct me which term I'm now misusing. So first of all, we can deal with multimodal data. The second thing we had to solve is the reality of how shit healthcare data is. Because that is just the reality, right? The copy and paste of clinical notes, the error bars on even your vitals observations. So we had to deal with messy data. And I'm starting to use this term of old AI and the new AI that's literally just coming through. So self-supervised learning and all that kind of cool tech. Yes. How do you actually make sense out of clinical messy, shitty data? So what we have built is kind of this massive tech stack here. We can read in all of these different types of data modalities. We can figure out which data points form the decision at the top and saying, this is the likelihood of a patient deteriorating. And then to your point of black box is the explainability that comes with it. So we had to do two things. One of them is You can use something called SHAPS values, which is how heavily has each data point featured in making that decision.
Brilliant.
And we surface that in an explainability dashboard to the clinical teams, and they absolutely love it.
Yeah.
If we say to them, for example, 73% likelihood of this patient developing a hospital-acquired infection over the next 7 days, they can click on it and it comes up and say, here are all the data values that have contributed to that decision. And similar to you as a clinician, you would have gone through, the first thing I look at, male, female. The second thing I will look at, age. Next thing I looked at is comorbidity. The next thing I looked at, what has the temperature been doing? What is the CRP value? And you just list it with an error bar on top and say, this is how heavily each featured. You building that trust back with the clinical teams. And of course, the regulator says, oh, great. I've got everything I need. I can trust it. Now, please show me the evidence. And this is where our business model is so cool, because we work with a number of hospital trusts in the UK, Germany and the US. We've got access to lots of the retrospective data. We take the model that we've built and we validate it in every single clinical setting we can get our hands on. And that means we can validate it on patient demographics, patient age, patient comorbidities, ethnicity, all that kind of stuff. So you're starting to generate an evidence file. And this is why I love regs. Old world reg is you try and minimize the data points you need to submit because they're obviously costly. We actually want to maximize it because I want to generate the evidence to show this is going to work regardless. And yeah, we've just gone through this process where it's taken us several months, which is groundbreaking because normally it takes years. But the team have just pulled out just such an unbelievable thing. So we're going to get Class 2B regulated AI as a medical device or software as a medical device, EU MDR in this quarter, which would be freaking amazing. Wow. It's terrifying because we're obviously going live in 2 weeks ahead of receiving the accreditation, because one of the hospitals we work with have said we have such an issue with sepsis and we have such an issue with infections. Well, infections obviously lead to sepsis. So if we can identify infections earlier, because we just don't have enough staff, the difference is even 24 hours earlier, and we can get them on the right, an oral antibiotic, and it's a highly complex patient. We can argue it prophylactically, saying, boom, we hope we can reduce the endpoint here is reduce complications, obviously. Wow. It is freaking amazing. And suddenly we're like, everything we dreamt of, all this kind of big arm wavy digital twins, co-pilots, AI this, AI that, we're now like, wow, this is directly impacting patient lives. And it's wow. So cool. It's so cool. It's fun.
All roads have been leading here for a while, haven't they? The final question that I had for you was actually about resource. Like what resource does this take? And, you know, you're building this at a time where it's difficult to raise capital. It's difficult to do lots of things because it's difficult to raise capital. Yep. I know that there's dry powder out there, but ultimately investors are putting a lot of additional kind of asks on this. Seed rounds are looking more like the requirements for A rounds and with traction and revenues or Bs. Yeah. How are you finding resourcing this? Where are you guys at? What do you need? And I guess, you know, plenty of people listen to this podcast. If you do have any asks at the minute, let us know. But I guess, like, how are you approaching that in this climate that we've got going on now?
I was on an investor call last week, and an American investor, and he looked at me because I said, well, how much money have you raised to date? And I said, well, about 2.3, 2.5 million. And he said, well, hang on, what? You're about to be fully regulated. And I said, and he then said, well, normally in the US, we would have seen a company raise like 100 million up to this point, right? And probably in Europe, 20 million or something. And I just kind of looked at him and said, yeah, the resource constraint that we're in has forced us to do three things that we would never done, right? The whole regulatory piece. If we'd gone down the traditional route, it would have taken us 3 to 5 years and cost us several £1 million. We had to rethink the way to get accreditation. We had to effectively build a software as a medical device factory that reduced the cost to get to accreditation by a factor of 10. The same thing with the AI model that we've built. We were forced to rethink the architecture. How can we use state-of-the-art models? How can we make sure that we always stay ahead? Well, we can't just say we're going to build a foundational large multimodal model, LMM, which is a new buzzword, and we're just going to raise $200 million and we're going to spend $150 million on an NVIDIA just to train up the models. So it forced us to be really resourceful. The third thing, what it forced us to do, and I'm really grateful for that, is if you boil it all the way down, it doesn't matter how good your health tech innovation is. It just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter your clinical performance. It ain't matter. The only thing that really matters is a clinician going to adopt it or not? Are they going to use it? So yes, of course, you've got to be better and all that, but it's down to that usability piece. And it's forced us to have to rethink, how can we get a clinical team, particularly nurses, to say, I'm going to do my observation rounds. Suddenly this thing pings at me and says, I think there's an infection happening. How do you get them to trust it, escalate it, and then trigger the standard deterioration protocol? And if I asked everyone out there, we're looking for more pilots, of course. And this investor then was saying, Benedikt, why are you not raising $100 million now? And I said, well, what would I do with $100 million right now? I would go and hire a team. And yes, I've got loads of ideas and I've got a business plan to spend it. But the thing I'm going to not do properly is obsess about that usability piece in the next 3 to 6 months. I need to nail that because that underpins my commercial model. So I've got to almost brutally force myself to be totally cash constrained, because the only metric that now matters is adoption and generating the evidence that it is adopted, because then I know that we've shown that the models improve outcomes. Then I can build the business case to say, your clinicians love it. It saves patient outcomes. And by the way, it improves patient flow in a hospital. I dare you, dear hospital CFO, to not adopt this. Because you're basically actively saying you don't want something that your clinical teams want. You want to make patient outcomes work, and you want to lose money.
So, and I suppose once you do that a few times, and then you realise that your sales cycle is actually pretty quick, and you realise, okay, now we're onto something. Then all of a sudden you feel more like you've got product market fit. Then the 100 million makes sense to go and do that in 3 geographies and all the rest of it, because then you're far more confident. You're not just going to, chuck it down the drain, and actually, you need, once you raise it, you need to spend it. And so actually you don't want to be spending it at a time where you don't have those assumptions tested. And therefore, it makes a lot of sense. I'll tell you what, mate, from like I tell you what, mate, I've interviewed a lot of entrepreneurs on this podcast, like 300 of them or something. And I think for someone that is looking at this industry with relatively fresh eyes, like you've done your homework, like what's going on, you say a lot of the right things. I think a lot of the people that we get from other industries come with the same, by the way, fantastic frustration at the way that things are done, but then with sometimes a little bit of a lack of respect for the clinicians, frankly, and actually a lack of, I guess, empathy for why they don't adopt things and the requirements to do so. It's why we have a lot of clinical entrepreneurs that are from the system building things, because they can get that innate buy-in very quickly. But that seems to be something that you understand. You seem to have this really nice way of understanding people's point of view and vantage points and positions that they're in. And actually, you're building this seemingly in the right way, with that empathy and understanding of everybody involved for what is the most important thing. And you called it out, which is that adoption by clinicians. If the clinicians can't adopt it, if it's not useful for them, you mentioned trust. That's huge, especially with AI models. Therefore, the transparency, which you mentioned, is huge with AI models, not just with the regulators, but with the clinicians. So I'm excited for this, mate. I'm excited for your journey. I think what you're doing's incredibly useful for our space. I've seen people come and try and fail with this, so I'm looking forward to seeing what happens here, mate. And by all means, get in touch if there's anything that I can do to help you, because it was super interesting to see how this pilot's go, man. And if there is anyone listening that is interested, then I definitely encourage them to get in touch. If people do want to get in touch with you, mate, what is the best way for them to do so?
LinkedIn. I think there's only one person with my name, LinkedIn. I was going to say WhatsApp, but email is very simple, benedikt@sanome.com. I don't respond to recruiters. But no, that's the first one. And thank you very much for your kind words, James. That does mean a lot, because whilst I have done biomedical sciences, I'm not a clinician. And very naively, it's kind of boils down to that simplicity and say, if the user, the nurse or the junior doctor doesn't want to use it, it doesn't matter how good I am. And maybe a closing thought, with what we are building, my father would still be around. It's a huge personal motivation, but ultimately is too many people die today because we don't have the resources in the healthcare system to spot early deterioration. And we need every bit of tool to support the overstretched clinicians that we have today with finding the patients that are deteriorating, understanding why they're deteriorating, enabling them to make better and earlier decisions to avoid these horrible tragedies that happen in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands across this healthcare system, not to mention kind of globally. And I think that's probably the most exciting journey you could ever be on, and saying, hey, I'm actually supporting where healthcare has to go. And let's go away and do it.